They didn't give Vivian Marsh a commendation. They gave her a subpoena. She found it tucked under the windshield wiper of her 9 Civic on a Tuesday morning, right next to a parking ticket she couldn't afford. The courthouse address was printed in a font so clean and official it looked like it belonged on a wall, not on a piece of paper meant for someone who'd just finished a double shift, and still had iodine under her fingernails. 3 weeks earlier, nobody at Mercy Regional knew her last name. They barely knew her first. She was the quiet one, the one who refilled the supply carts without being asked and ate her lunch, standing up in the break room, because she never remembered to sit down. Night shift. Trauma bay. 7 years of it, and she'd perfected the art of being invisible. That was the point. The smell of the trauma bay at 2 a.m. is something you never forget. Antiseptic and copper, and something underneath both of those things, something older, more animal. Vivian had stopped noticing it years ago, the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic outside your apartment window. It was just the air, just the place where she lived most of her life. She was restocking IV bags when the radio crackled. GSW, multiple entry points, systolic pressure dropping. ETA 4 minutes. 4 minutes. She set down the IV bag carefully, walked to the board, looked at the attending on call, Dr. Fenwick. 58 years old, 17 years in emergency medicine, and he was in the middle of a laceration repair that was going sideways. His hands were busy. His resident, a second-year named Tatum, who'd never seen anything worse than a bar fight, was already turning pale at the edges. Vivian didn't say anything. She pulled on a second pair of gloves and started moving. The doors blew open at 2:14 a.m. He came in on a gurney with 2 paramedics leaning over him and a third running alongside. Vivian didn't catch his name from the intake form. She didn't need to. She could read the wound pattern before they finished transferring him to the bay table. 2 entry points left lateral thorax. 1 lower, 1 higher. The lower one was the problem. The angle, the proximity to the iliac, she knew what was bleeding before they hooked up the monitor. Pressure's 68/40, Tatum said, voice climbing. Where's Fenwick? Someone called. Still in 3, bowel perforation, can't break scrub. Vivian was already at the cabinet. She pulled a 16 French Foley catheter from the back of the shelf. Not where it was supposed to be, because she'd moved it 6 months ago and never told anyone, and turned back to the table. What are you doing? Tatum asked. Vivian didn't answer. There wasn't time to explain, and there wasn't time to wait. She'd done this before, in a place she never talked about, under conditions that made a trauma bay look like a spa. She found the femoral pulse, still there, barely, and began. The room went quiet, in the way rooms only go quiet when everyone present understands that something important is happening, and none of them know what it is. She inflated the balloon at the catheter tip slowly, carefully. This wasn't a textbook maneuver. It was a field adaptation of resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta. The kind of thing you learned not in a residency program, but in a place where the nearest surgical suite was a 3-hour helicopter, ride away, and the man in front of you had maybe 8 minutes. She'd learned it from a trauma surgeon who'd spent 2 tours in Fallujah and had the disposition of someone who'd stopped being surprised by anything. His pressure is going up, a nurse said, bewildered. Checking the monitor again like it might have made a mistake. 78/45. Vivian kept her hands where they were. 86/50. Tatum was staring at her. Get Fenwick, Vivian said quietly. He needs a proper OR and he needs it in the next 20 minutes. Tell them retroperitoneal bleed, probable iliac involvement, temporarily tamponated. Those exact words. Tatum didn't move for a full second. Then she went. The man on the table had brown hair going gray at the temples and a tattoo on his left forearm that Vivian recognized. Not the design, but the placement, the deliberate placement, the way it sat just below the point where a sleeve would cover it. She'd seen that before, too. She kept working. Fenwick came in 7 minutes later with his gloves already on and stopped just inside the doorway. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the patient. He looked at Vivian. Who? I work nights, she said. Trauma bay. 7 years. She stepped back from the table, already stripping her outer gloves. He's stable enough to move. Balloons in place, volumes running, he's had 1 unit of ONEG. You've got a window. Fenwick crossed to the table and put his hands on the patient with the practiced economy of a man who'd learned not to waste motion. His eyes moved over everything Vivian had done. The catheter, the line placement, the dressing she'd put over the lower wound to control surface bleeding. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, get two on the phone. They took the patient up at 2:31 a.m., 17 minutes after the doors had blown open. Vivian pulled off her gloves, dropped them in the bin, and went to restock the IV bags she'd left on the cart. She didn't go home after her shift. She sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that had been sitting in the pot since midnight, and stared at the window, which looked out onto the parking structure, which looked like every other parking structure she'd ever seen. She was very tired. She was always very tired, but this particular tired had weight to it, the kind that settled into your shoulders and stayed. She wasn't supposed to have done what she'd done. Not legally. Not within the scope of her nursing license. What she'd performed was a physician procedure, and she'd performed it without a physician present, and if the patient had died on the table, if the balloon had slipped, if the pressure had dropped too fast, if any of 100 variables had gone wrong, she'd have been looking at the end of her career and possibly a criminal charge. But he hadn't died. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. She'd made a choice 7 years ago to be invisible. It was a deliberate choice, made in a very specific set of circumstances that she never discussed with anyone. She'd left a life that was not the kind of life you left gracefully, and she'd built this one with her hands quietly in the margins. Night shift. Trauma bay. The supply cart. The iodine under her fingernails. She'd been doing fine. She drank the coffee, which was terrible, and went to her car. The 2 men were waiting for her in the hospital lobby the following Thursday. She saw them before they saw her, or before they showed that they saw her, which wasn't the same thing. Dark suits. The particular kind of posture that came from years of training, and then years of trying to look like you hadn't had years of training. The one on the left was older, mid-50s, with the face of someone who'd delivered bad news so many times it had smoothed out his features. The one on the right was younger and was working harder at looking casual. Vivian kept walking. Ms. Marsh, she stopped. The older one held up a credential wallet. Agent Cutter, Dia. This is Agent Yeo. Could we speak somewhere private? Not FBI, Defense Intelligence Agency. That told her several things at once. She looked at him for a moment. There's a conference room on the 2nd floor they don't use on Thursdays, she said. Follow me. The conference room smelled like dry erase markers and old carpet. Vivian sat down on one side of the table. The 2 agents sat on the other side. Agent Cutter put a folder on the table but didn't open it. The patient you treated last week, he said. We need to understand how you stabilized him. I'm a trauma nurse. I treated a patient in crisis. With a technique, Agent Yeo said, that isn't in any nursing curriculum we've found. Vivian looked at him. He was maybe 32, and he had the particular energy of someone who'd been very good at something demanding for a long time and hadn't yet learned how to turn it off in a room where it wasn't needed. She recognized that energy. She'd had it once. I've been doing this for 7 years, she said. You learn things. Ms. Marsh. Agent Cutter opened the folder. He turned it around and pushed it across the table. The patient's name is Commander Dex Rourke. No, different Rourke, she reminded herself. Not one of the names. He's been operational in a classified context for the past 18 months. He was found 2 miles from the county line with no ID, no phone, and no vehicle. The wounds were consistent with a close-range ambush. Vivian looked at the photo in the folder. Same brown hair going gray, same tattoo placement. Is he going to make it? She asked. Surgery went well. He's in recovery. Cutter paused. He's asking about you. She didn't say anything. Here's what we know, Cutter said. His voice was very level. The voice of a man reading from a list he'd memorized long ago. We know you were born in Clatskanie, Oregon. We know you attended the University of Oregon for 2 semesters before you dropped out. We know you enrolled in an LPN program in Spokane and graduated top of your class. We know you've been at Mercy Regional for 7 years. with an essentially spotless record. We know you drive a 2009 Civic and your rent is 4 weeks late. He stopped. And we know, he said, that there are 11 years between when you left Oregon and when you showed up in Spokane, and in those 11 years, there is almost nothing. No tax filings, no credit activity, no registered vehicles, no leases. Almost nothing. The dry erase marker smell was very strong. Vivian folded her hands on the table. What do you want to know? She said. We want to know. Agent Yeo said, where you learned to do what you did to that man in the trauma bay. Because we've shown the footage to 3 separate trauma surgeons, and one of them said it was the cleanest field Reboa adaptation he'd ever seen. And none of them could figure out where a night shift trauma nurse in a regional hospital in eastern Washington would have encountered it. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. Outside the conference room window, the parking structure sat in the gray morning light. A car pulled into a space on the 3rd level. Someone got out carrying a paper coffee cup. I want to talk to Rourke first, she said. They took her up to the 4th floor in a services elevator, which she found faintly insulting but chose not to comment on. The room had a man outside the door who was trying very hard to look like an ordinary hospital visitor and failing in every particular. Vivian had known 4 people in her life who could actually do that, pass as ordinary, and she wasn't looking at one of them. She went in. Rourke was awake. He looked like what he was, a man who'd lost a significant amount of blood and hadn't yet caught up on the deficit, but his eyes were clear. He tracked her from the door. You're her, he said. Depends on who you're asking about. He studied her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not recognition exactly, more like orientation. The way you recalibrate when a situation turns out to be different than your initial read. They told me what you did, he said. In the bay. You're alive, she said. Don't read too much into it. Where did you? I'm going to ask you something first, Vivian said. She pulled the chair from beside the bed and sat down, not close, not far. The practiced distance of someone who'd learned to calibrate space. The ambush. Do you know who ordered it? Rourke was still watching her. Why does that matter to you? Because if it came from inside, your 2 guys in suits downstairs have a problem they haven't figured out yet. And if they haven't figured it out yet, you're not safe in this room. She glanced at the window. Or this floor. A pause. It came from inside, he said. She nodded. She'd already thought it might. There's a man named Gideon Falk, Rourke said. His voice was careful, measured. The voice of a man deciding in real time how much to give. He's been running a parallel operation, off the books, private contracting, certain government adjacencies that nobody's willing to put their name on. I found something I wasn't supposed to find. Document trail, payments, names. He paused. They needed me not to make it back, but you made it back. Because of you. Vivian looked at her hands. They were steady. They were always steady. The documents, she said. Where are they? Memorized. All of it. He tapped his temple, a gesture that cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw. They can take the drive. They can take the backup. It doesn't matter. It's all in here. Then you need to be somewhere else, she said. Before whoever sent the team figures out you're still breathing and sends another one. She stood up, smoothed her scrubs. The gesture was automatic, the settling in of a person who'd been doing this long enough that the uniform was part of the skin. I'm going to tell Cutter about the internal compromise, she said. Whether he believes me is his problem, but you need to be moved tonight. Vivian Marsh. She looked at him. Who are you? He asked, not accusing, genuinely asking. The kind of question that meant, I've been doing this long enough to know what I'm looking at, and what I'm looking at doesn't match the file. She considered the question. I'm a trauma nurse, she said. Night shift. 7 years. He almost smiled. Right. She found Cutter in the hallway, standing with Agent Yeo and a 3rd person she hadn't seen before. A woman in her 40s with the particular stillness of someone very senior trying to pass as middling. Vivian had seen that too. You have a compromise, Vivian said. She kept her voice low, not whispering. Whispering was conspicuous, but quiet and even. The ambush on Rourke wasn't external. Someone with access to his operational schedule fed the location. You need to move him tonight, and you need to do it with a team that wasn't read into his last assignment." The woman in her 40s looked at Vivian for a long moment. "And you know this how?" she said. "He told me, and I believe him." She paused. "Your surveillance team on the third floor of the parking structure is good, by the way. The one on the roof is less good. He's been in the same position for 40 minutes. People noticed that. Nobody said anything." "I'm going back to work," Vivian said. "I have a shift in 3 hours." She turned toward the elevator. "Mrs. Marsh." Cutter's voice. She stopped but didn't turn. "We're going to need to talk. About the 11 years." She pressed the elevator button. "I know," she said. "But not today." The folder they eventually put together on Vivian Lee Marsh, born Vivian Lee Doss, a name that appeared in exactly 3 government databases before disappearing, ran to 64 pages. Agent Cutter read it twice on a plane, to a city he wasn't authorized to discuss in a report that itself was classified at a level that meant fewer than 40 people in the country would ever read it. What the folder described was a woman who had, at the age of 22, been recruited by a program that no longer officially existed into a role that had never officially been codified. She'd spent 8 years as a forward medical specialist, a term that meant something very different from what it sounded like, attached to teams operating in environments that did not appear in any public record. She'd been trained by a man named Kessler, who'd since retired to a small farm in Vermont and declined all contact with former colleagues. She'd been in 4 countries that she was never supposed to have visited, treated injuries in conditions that would have been unacceptable in any medical context that anyone could acknowledge, and learned things that weren't in any curriculum because the circumstances that required them were themselves officially unacknowledged. And then, at 30, she'd left. The reason wasn't in the folder. Cutter had looked for it. The closest thing he found was a 3-sentence incident summary from a program review dated almost a decade earlier, with the operative's name redacted, but the context narrow enough that it couldn't have been anyone else. He read those 3 sentences, standing next to the airplane window at 30,000 feet, and he thought about the woman he'd met in the conference room, the stillness of her, the way she'd sat with her hands folded, the way she'd clocked the surveillance team on the roof in the same breath she was telling him his operation was compromised, and he understood. She'd built herself a quiet life. On purpose. In the margins. He closed the folder. Commander Rourke was moved that night. Cutter didn't tell Vivian where. He sent her a text message from a number she recognized as temporary. 3 words. "It's handled. Thank you." And then the number went dark. She deleted the message and went to work. The trauma bay was quiet for the first half of the shift. She restocked the supply carts. She refilled the IV bags. She checked the defibrillator pads and the expiration dates on the epinephrine, and made a note on the log about the suture kit in Bay 3 that was missing its 4-0 nylon. Around midnight, Tatum found her in the supply room. "That patient," Tatum said, "from last week, the one who came in critical. What about him?" "I looked up the technique. What you did." Tatum was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't find it in any nursing textbook." Vivian reached past her for a box of gloves. "No, you wouldn't. Where did you learn it?" The supply room was small and smelled like plastic packaging, and the particular industrial clean smell of things that had been sterilized many times. The fluorescent light above them buzzed once, faintly, and then went quiet. "A long time ago," Vivian said, "from someone who learned it the hard way." She handed Tatum a box of medium gloves. She'd noticed Tatum always took smalls, but her hands were actually a medium, and this was the kind of thing Vivian noticed, and walked back toward the bay. At 3 in the morning, a car accident came in, a family of 4. The father had a head injury that was going to need a neurosurgical consult, and the mother had a fractured radius and was trying to stay calm for the 2 kids, who were unhurt but terrified. Vivian took the kids to the waiting room and sat with them for 11 minutes while the attending worked on their parents. 11 minutes was all she could spare, and she told them that the people in that room were very good at their jobs, which was true, and that their mom and dad were going to be okay, which she believed was probably true. and she got them juice boxes from the vending machine with her own quarters because the family voucher system involved a form, and a form took time. Then she went back to work. The subpoena under the windshield wiper was not, in the end, from the DIA. It was from a Senate subcommittee that had been quietly investigating the program Vivian had once been part of, the program that officially didn't exist. And someone on that subcommittee had found a thread and pulled it, and one of the threads had led, eventually and circuitously, to a trauma bay in eastern Washington and a nurse who'd performed an unapproved procedure on a classified operative and then told a senior DIA officer that his surveillance team had a positioning problem. The subpoena was requesting her testimony. Closed session. Classified setting. She read it in the hospital parking lot at 7 in the morning, standing next to her Civic, with the early light coming flat and gray across the parking structure, and the city just barely beginning to wake up around her. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she went back inside. Her next shift started in 6 hours. She had charting to finish from the night before, and the suture kit in Bay 3 still needed to be restocked, and Tatum had left a question on the whiteboard in the break room about chest tube placement that deserved a real answer. Vivian poured herself a cup of coffee. Fresh this time, she'd started it herself before she'd gone to her car, and sat down at the charting station. The subpoena could wait. The work couldn't.